All right.
Okay.
Okay. First question. How did you come to think about and create work at the intersection of art and architecture?
So I initially studied painting, and I was really interested in non-representation of painting, so abstract painting. And I started to think about the space of a canvas as not actually very dissimilar from floor plan, because on some level a floor plan is an abstraction, right? It's not actually physical space, but a kind of distorted or abstracted representation of that. And I started moving away from painting objects and was more interested in somehow engaging physical space. So I started creating installations and kind of site-specific work, but on some level I really started becoming more and more interested in architecture because it's an inherently political discipline, right? Just by virtue of drawing a line in a CAD software, there's all of these incredible political implications of that. So I became very fascinated with the discourse surrounding modernism and also started to realize how actually intertwined those disciplines were between art and architecture. And obviously architecture having some sort of utopian or social function, right, but also an artistic function as well. So that's kind of how I started thinking about it, and now I've become increasingly interested in different kinds of spatial politics. So it's not so much about architecture as a kind of capital A or a discipline, but in the question of space and spatial practice. So I think that can transcend all sorts of disciplines, whether it be kind of work of video art or performance, but somehow as long as there's some way of it ricocheting against some sort of spatial framework, whether it be a building, whether it be a community, whether it be a kind of public space, there's something about spatial thinking that I'm very drawn to.
In your work, how do you go about sourcing, handling, and installing your work?
So I design all of the work using kind of architectural software, and then the work is made over the course of different processes. So I will use CNC routing, laser cutting, and sometimes water jet cutting. So there's this way in which the work begins as a kind of 3D model, a digital 3D model, and then is then translated into two-dimensional representation, and then back into a physical kind of configuration. So in order to do that, I will work with some sort of digital fabricator, but then we'll often assemble all of the work myself.
Following that up, how do you think about temporality in your work, i.e. more of like extending the idea and consequences of potential deconstruction of environments, and where materials might go afterwards, if there's an afterwards?
I mean, time is something I think a lot about, actually, because often my work is ephemeral, right? It only exists in space for a certain amount of time. So in many ways, I've kind of often thought about the work as akin to dance on some level, right? It has this kind of very limited moment in space. And then of course there's also the kind of temporal dimension that happens while the installation is up, right? So I'm really interested in kind of various lighting conditions, the way the work kind of again ricochets off of the path of the sun, or how I can kind of control what's already there, which already has a kind of temporal element to it. But then afterwards, I mean, I tend to work with a lot of standardized building materials, and that relates to kind of conceptual interest in thinking about standardization and the production of subjectivity, which we've talked a lot about. But a lot of those materials, since they are not necessarily for sale as art objects, are donated to reuse facilities like Build It Green in New York.
I love Build It centers.
Yeah.
They're really great. So along that line, these next two questions will kind of follow that. What do you think about detrimental consumption of materials like wood, concrete, and steel? And can you tie that to what you think about your own work?
Well, I mean, I guess I don't know as much about the construction industry. I mean, I think there's certainly any designer should think about sustainability, right? I mean, I think that kind of goes without saying at this point, right? But I think it is interesting to think about what materials have more longevity versus what materials are used to kind of add some sort of curb appeal or some sort of or raise their aesthetic and symbolic value. So obviously I'm really interested in the presence of glass in a lot of new construction and the kind of symbolic and political consequences of that. But I know for sure that a lot of buildings and architecture firms have been thinking about using less concrete and instead using more wood, for instance, to build frames, etc. But actually, concrete makes me think, and I'm not the first to think about this. I think David Harvey has written really beautifully about this. But the production of concrete or the use of concrete in places like China are really this opportunity to generate other kinds of industry around it. So, China has produced some insane amount of concrete over the past several years, and that's really been to add more jobs, add more building, add more. Hard question. I mean, obviously on some level there are all sorts of exploitative and grisly labor conditions associated with certain building materials. And I mean, obviously, think about asbestos, right, as a kind of material that's been banned in most new construction, or all construction. But I guess I'm interpreting your question as like, how can there be a greater feedback loop between the kind of work that's made in a factory and how that could somehow translate to the lived space or change the lived space somehow? And I don't know. That's a really good question. I'd have to think more about it, but I'd like to believe that's the case. But I think it really is specific to the kind of material you're talking about on some level, and how ubiquitous it is, right? I mean, something that can be interesting is to think about the proliferation of certain materials and how the.
Do you see any movements in the built environment that stick out to you at the moment in time?
Well, for what we were just talking about, the use of glass is something that I've obviously spent a lot of time thinking about. And we've talked about in our class, but as related to a kind of greater desire to signify city. But I would be hard pressed to find successful examples of that. I think more often it's the case that glass ends up being a kind of signifier of capital, or kind of high-end development, exclusionary practices, right? So I'm often really interested in the question of like, what is material or form doing, rather than what is it just simply mean in and of itself. And so something that I don't think we can overlook is the kind of tie between kind of luxury development in glass, kind of shimmering curtain walls in glass. It's also seen reflected in many new kind of institutional projects like the Whitney Museum, renovation of the Art Center. I mean, any number of kind of public buildings that I think are intending to signal choice and transparency. And that's something that I think is on there. In terms of other design trends, I mean, I think glass is also used in corporate architecture, not simply in terms of its facade, but even in its interior. So a lot of times corporations have done away with cubicles, right, in order to promote collaboration, productivity. So glass is used in these spaces so that everyone can see one another, but this also kind of regulates the worker on some level, creates larger forms of surveillance. So it's a material that I've been increasingly interested in. I've spent a lot of time thinking about, especially because of its early ties to utopian thought. And so in many ways, it's very much counter to what it's intended to be, right? I mean, glass in many ways is just inextricably tied to capitalism. Right? It's a material that we encounter everything. We look through it without even realizing it's there on some level. There's something about that that I find both really beautiful and harrowing and terrifying at the same time. But glass,
Glass.
for sure. Yeah.
Glass, absolutely. So, kind of discussed this. Do you think about things like 3D? What do you think about things like 3D printing, which could offer the relief from strenuous manual labor production? Is this a potential way of giving people authority in their own lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know about the latter part of the question, but I think 3D printing has revolutionized certainly different industries, not simply building, but I mean, I know it's often used in the medical industry, and I'm really fascinated by that. They've 3D printed parts of cranial structure, different parts of bone fragments. And it also raises really interesting questions, for instance, if you are on a cruise ship or some other kind of ship, and a part there that is very difficult to access breaks. Theoretically, 3D print that part. So I think it's a really fascinating technology, and I'm sure we haven't even scratched the surface of what it's capable of. And 3D printing all sorts of materials, and I think this would raise really interesting implications for food as well, somehow. I think that eventually everyone will have a 3D printer, or at least 3D printing will be far cheaper than it actually is now. And ideally, it'll be a much more accessible form of production. So yeah, I'm all for 3D printing.
Last two questions. I'm trying to come up with a way to think about alternative and green materials in relationship with art and architecture. Do you see any ways these ideas can work together?
An alternative to what?
And alternative materials, an alternative to conventional materials, working together in relationship with art and architecture. Kind of this idea of green building somehow becoming a medium of art and architecture, mixing as well. Kind of a loose question.
Yeah.
I don't really know where to.
I don't know. I mean, I would definitely look into history of land art, for instance. I think it's complicated because land art. It sounds like what you're asking is about sustainability, right? And using materials that are non-hazardous, not wasteful necessarily, right? But I think that also raises some questions about commodification, right? And how maybe to resist that on some level. Land art as a kind of historical or art historical category is really interesting to kind of mine, just because it was incredibly difficult to commodify. So it existed outside of the space of the gallery, right? So there's this thing that couldn't be bought or sold. Well, it's also interesting though because it raises all sorts of questions of colonialism and imperialism, right? Because who has ownership over the land, as was evidenced by the Kodak pipeline, etc. So I think, the idea that sustainable design could be a medium, I'm not so sure if it's a medium. I don't know if this is even the question, but I think it's better a kind of practice or a kind of way of thinking about discipline, right? And I think that's certainly something that I would hope most architects, if not artists, are conscious of. But I would also be aware or put a little pressure on the idea of, for instance, LEED certified buildings, because often it's actually a question of whether or not it's doing it. In many cases, LEED, which is a very costly kind of entry point, ends up just signifying, that you are a do-gooder, right? There's this insignia that you can put on your building and whatnot, so it carries this kind of symbolic value in the marketplace, which is not a good or a bad thing. I mean, it's just an interesting kind of maybe quirky example of the way I think some of these certification processes for green building actually have a currency.
That is a great interpretation, and working with what I gave you, I appreciate that. It's really helping. Last question. Looking forward, how do you see the built environment changing in which the reflexive and systematic systems value the public? In other words, to invert or alter the systems your work tries to expose, and thinking of your work in some ways of pointing out the reflexive nature of architecture having authority over people and systematically involving racial inequality and other hegemony.
So can you rephrase it? Are you asking how I see architecture as giving back? Or?
I'm saying if you do see any ways in which, because I think it's such a hypothetical, it's such a difficult thing to understand, but ways in which you could see examples actually functioning of it, where that conversation's, where it's turned around, and if it's possible to see it turn around and start to inform in the other way.
That's a really great question. I definitely spend a lot of time looking at examples. Definitely spend a lot of time looking at examples. I know, for instance, in Sweden, for instance, where mass incarceration is a very different problem in the United States, they've often had to convert abandoned prisons into other structures. Right? And so this is a really interesting social problem, or positive one, right? To think about incarceration being this outmoded practice, right, that leaves behind these kind of relics, these kind of enclosures that we're talking about today, that need to be repurposed. So there's that example, and then of course, with deindustrialization, many spaces were left over, right? So, probably the most common use of a former industrial building is to turn it into an art museum. So, while I would want to put a little bit more pressure on that, for your question, it's more of a positive one. So I would think that maybe on some level there's some value to that, to think about maybe the relationship between industrial production and cultural production, right? But I think the example of prisons is probably one of my favorite examples of this kind of this architecture, this structure that obviously has really insidious practices attached to it, and somehow had to be rethought. I'd have to think more about other examples where that's been kind of put into reverse. But I love the idea, for instance, of kind of maybe, for instance, if we all had access to air rights, right, we could maybe then block development somehow. So if air rights were cheaper, maybe someone could buy air rights across the street, and then if I own that air right, that somehow it would block gentrification. This is a very kind of utopian way of thinking about it. There are these kinds of maybe more legal, infrastructural ways of thinking about something that you put into reverse or used for good. So there's something to that. I don't know, I'd love to think more about it. I mean, I'd have to think more about other kind of spatial typologies that were at one point that you wanted, but have since been reversed. Many prisons have been reconverted into things, but I like the Swedish example as like this kind of this condition right, throughout the country. It's a good question.
That's great. That's great. No, that's such a. I didn't know about. What are they converting the prisons into?
Various things. I mean, it's actually the problem is how to reconvert them, right? Or what to convert them into. Again, I think the easiest example would be to turn it into a museum or an art gallery, art space of some kind. I mean, and this has kind of real kind of architectural significance, right? Because the museum is actually quite bare bones when you think about it, versus functioning for habitation, residence, right? Which is much more significant. I think it was Johannesburg or Cape Town, a massive industrial facility was just converted into a new contemporary museum. So, I mean, this is not an isolated example. I mean, it's throughout the country, obviously. Look at Tia Beacon, any number of PS1 is a former school. So, I think to look at the relationship between art as this kind of industry, right, or this new kind of form of production, makes a lot of sense when you think about the spaces buildings become. But I'm going to think more about it.
No, thank you. I love that. Yeah.